Godzilla, definitely the biggest and noisiest movie of the week.
Yes.
Take it away.
In large part, I like it. The original movie, I mean, as Gareth was saying there, the Ishiro Honda movie, which was then recut into Godzilla King of the Monsters with all the Raymond Burr stuff, and what they did was they sort of took out the nuclear stuff, an awful lot of the subtext. I mean, actually, the funny thing was there was this re-release of Godzilla Gojira that the BFI did 2005, 2006, in which a lot of UK viewers got to see for the first time that the original movie as it had appeared in 1954, and were very struck by how melancholic and how poignant and just the level of depth that it had. I mean, you know, how much was going on in it that they hadn't been aware of because of seeing, you know, Godzilla King of the Monsters, which was a very different film. Obviously, in that original film, it is very much about nuclear anxiety. It came out of not only the wake of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also nuclear testing in the Pacific Atoll. There was there's a documentary that was actually on the BFI DVD release called The Japanese Fisherman about Lucky Dragon number 5, you know, the Japanese fishing boat in which all this sort of atomic dust had actually blown over them, sort of horrifying story. But that was the background to the release of the original movie. This starts with this very well-constructed faux newsreel footage, you know, of nuclear testing, in which what they've done is they've sort of fiddled around with it, and it looks like what you're watching is archival newsreel footage with these kind of strange glimpses of this sort of reptile-like creature in the background. So it does this kind of flip, which was actually those weren't nuclear tests. Those were attempting to destroy something. At the very, very end of the opening credits, you see what it was that they were attempting to destroy, which is nicely set up. Then what happens is we fast forward to a nuclear family, mother, father, son, who are then...
So you're using nuclear family there in both, it's a full sense.
In both senses, then torn apart by an accident at a power plant, which you were talking about this in the interview, the kind of echoes of Fukushima, right down to the fact that it's put down to a natural disaster, that what appears to happen is an earthquake happens underneath them and the reactor sort of falls into it. Then we fall forward again. We get Aaron Taylor Johnson now as a bomb disposal expert. So, I mean, all this stuff is all going, you know, it's all sort of knitted all the way through. He's back with his wife, but he's torn apart from his wife by the fact that his father, who has now become a crackpot conspiracy theorist, has been arrested once again in Japan for trespassing in the irradiated area in which his home and his business used to be, because he believes that the government are hiding something. Of course, the government are hiding something, though not entirely what he expected. So basically written into the script all the way through is that thing which did drive the original, which is that it's to do with radiation, it's to do with atomic energy, it's to do with nuclear power, although what they've done is quite cleverly played with the relationship between those two things. If you're a fan of monsters, and I think both you and I were, the thing that everybody commented on, and again you raised this in the interview with Gareth Edwards, is that it was almost like a portrayal of a relationship that just happened to be interrupted by the arrival of very large extraterrestrial creatures, but you believed in the people first. In the case of Godzilla, for the first hour, it's fairly judicious with its spectacular displays. Not that there aren't any, but it is just as interested in making you believe in the characters. And I think actually the relationship between Aaron Taylor Johnson and Elizabeth Olsen as the husband and wife, who was sort of ripped apart by the fact that his father, played by Bryan Cranston, has apparently gone crazy, go nuts, is rather well done. So he does take, as he did before, the same time. I mean, perhaps not in quite the same depth, because Monsters was very much an indie film in which it was notable for the lack of spectacular display. I mean, there are monsters in it, but it's basically the whole thing about that title is that it's ironic. Who are the monsters? And actually the question is that the monsters may not be the extraterrestrials at all. There is also, in this version of Godzilla, that lingering Clive Barker-esque love of the monstrous. In fact, there is one sequence in Godzilla which seems very clearly to quote the final movement of Monsters, in which there's that really strange thing when he's out by the petrol station and you see these two, they're kind of like strange walking squids in Monsters, and they sort of join tentacles across, and it's weird and it's eerie and it's romantic and it's kind of quite beautiful. Well, in amidst the carnage of the second hour of Godzilla, in which everything becomes very, it's kind of big and spectacular and chaotic, there is this strange moment which does seem to hark back to that monster. So firstly, he is still interested in the characters. Secondly, the monsters themselves are never just simply monsters. Even the monstrous ones, even the Mutos, as you were talking about before, massive unidentified terrestrial organisms, even they are clearly drawn by somebody who has a delight in their monstrousness. That does remind me very much of Clive Barker. I remember Barker saying, the problem with most monster movies is that in the first hour of the movie you see a foot, in the second hour of the movie you see a nose, and in the third movement you see the whole thing very briefly before it's blown up by an atom bomb. And I was surprised to hear you said that some people have complained about the lack of Gojira in. Incidentally, the first time Ken Watanabe says it, he says Gojira, and then they default back to Godzilla. But so it's, they are aware of the history. And actually, one of the things I like about this film is it's clearly made by somebody who both understands and appreciates and is kind of in love with what it was that made the Ishiro Honda version, the original version, interesting. But when you finally get, okay, it's monster time, or as you refer to it, Godzilla time, you need to be seeing it on the biggest screen possible, because there is a whole movement of the film which is, blimey, Charlie, that is a really big thing. And there's another really big, but because they've taken the time to establish the narrative around it, it works, so that when you finally get to him, and I didn't feel for 1 minute that we saw too much of Godzilla. I thought that when we saw him, we had enough established that we kind of were able to understand what it, because you sort of see glimpses and you sort of see overhead shots and you see stuff under the sea, but you're meant to be awe-inspired, and you kind of are. I mean, the interesting thing about Godzilla is that he actually has a very likable face. I don't mean this in a kind of cute way, but the designers have talked about Kermode dragons and bears. It's almost a canine face. It's almost like a massive bull mastiff face. And of course, the whole legend of Godzilla anyways goes from being scourged to sort of saviour figure. And there is a very smart thing about sympathy. I mean, it was interesting reading an interview with Gareth Edwards in which he said they actually turned to Andy Serkis at one point to be advised on, in the way in which he was controlling the souls of things. Obviously, Andy Serkis is the motion capture king of the world. And you do get three-dimensional creatures. You do get not just monsters. And I kept thinking of how ironic the title of Monsters is, because, of course, it's not, it's actually not specifically referring to the space aliens. There are problems. One of the problems is that there's a number of characters that kind of get lost in the mix. And most notably, Sally Hawkins, who does turn up at the beginning, worry tremulously, and then kind of disappear. And then you sort of wonder what happened to her character. And in the rush of the third act, you do get the feeling that character has kind of fallen by the way as we move into the massive, because it's, what they're aware of, it's a Godzilla film. You're going to want to see huge scenes of really big stuff happening, and during those sequences the coming back to the individual characters doesn't always work as well, and but one of the reasons for that is that the monsters are kind of more interesting than the characters sometimes, and I think actually that's perversely a strength. So overall, I thought, firstly, his intentions were entirely right. Was to honour the original, but to do something different with it, to keep it rooted in the themes of the original, but to move them on and do something different. Secondly, he understands that in terms of a Godzilla movie, he's going to have to deliver in it being spectacular. And you yourself said, because you saw it before I did, and I said, what's it like? You said, see it on a really big, really loud screen.
It's worth spending an extra. I mean, it is an expensive business anyway, as we all know.
Yeah.
But if you can find one with a decent screen and a decent sound system, that's the one to go.
But the most important thing for me is, and I think that actually the bigger the screen, the less the sort of inherent narrative problems in the third act will bother you. Because if you're seeing it on a smaller screen, you might start to worry about character development and all that kind of thing. If you see it on a big screen, frankly, you can skin peeling off your face with the fiery, icy roar. But in the end, what I think Gareth Edwards has managed to do is to take a $160 million film and make it his film. Now, whenever you deal with something that big, there are going to be, you're always, it's, what you want and what everybody else wants, and there are going to be, so it's not the same as making Monsters. It's not the same as making a movie when you wander along, on a road journey, and then you go back and you spend however many years it is doing the stuff in your bedroom. It's not going to be that film. But I still think it's a Gareth Edwards film. And we've seen so many examples of directors who have made a really impressive low-budget first feature, who've then been snapped up to helm a big-budget second feature, and, suddenly they've got lost in the mix. And this hasn't happened. So overall, thumbs up.